The silence has lasted longer than anyone expected, not the quiet withdrawal of someone who has accepted a reduced public role and is managing gracefully into a smaller version of their former life. This is something more deliberate than that, more calculated. The kind of silence that belongs to someone who is actively deciding, day by day, what to say and what not to say, and in what order and in what format, and to which audience and at what price. 213 days out of the public eye before the Austrian Alps sighting. 6 companies dissolved in 72 hours, a congressional request for testimony that has received no public response. A charity closed, patronages ended. And somewhere in all of that deliberate absence, the reported negotiation of a sit-down interview worth as much as £1.3 million, that is not someone who has gone quiet because they have nothing to say. That is someone who is managing what they say with the specific care of a person who understands that what they say, and when and how they say it, is one of the last remaining assets they have. Sarah Ferguson has been silent for the better part of a year. But the silence itself is a communication, and understanding what it is communicating, what strategy it represents, what options it is keeping open, what it is designed to preserve, is the most revealing thing available about where she is and what she is planning to do next. Start with why the silence became necessary in the first place: the Epstein files. The January 2026 release of material that had been sealed for years, released in the specific and legally significant form of the Epstein court documents, contained communications involving Sarah Ferguson that fundamentally altered the public's understanding of her relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Not new information in the broad sense that she had known Epstein, that financial assistance had passed between them, that her relationship with him had continued longer than she had publicly acknowledged. All of that had been reported to varying degrees before January 2026. What changed was the specificity, the actual language of the communications. The timestamps, the documentary evidence of the gap between what she had said publicly and what the private record showed. She called him her spectacular and special friend. She thanked him for being the brother she had always wished for. She told him she was proud of him while he was serving a prison sentence for crimes against a minor. She wrote to him in January 2010 to say she was at his service and told him to just marry her. In April 2011, after publicly denouncing him and promising to have nothing more to do with him, she sent him a private apology and described him as her steadfast, generous, and supreme friend. The following month, she wrote asking for his guidance on how she should handle questions about him in an upcoming Oprah Winfrey interview. Each of those communications, taken individually, might be contextualized in ways that soften the impression it creates. Taken together, in sequence, against the timeline of what was publicly known about Epstein at each point, they form a picture that is extremely difficult to reconcile with the public statements she made about her relationship with him. The gap between the public and the private became, once the documents were released, the central fact of her situation, not the association with Epstein itself, which had always been part of her story. The specific, documented, time-stamped contradiction between what she told the world and what the private record shows she was simultaneously doing, that gap is what makes the silence necessary. Because every public statement she makes now is made against the backdrop of that documented contradiction, and any statement that attempts to address the contradiction directly runs the risk of making the problem worse rather than better. If she says she did not fully understand who Epstein was until later, the private timeline of her communications contradicts that. If she says she was a victim of his financial manipulation, the warmth and the intimacy and the specific language of the emails makes victimhood very difficult to sustain as the primary frame. If she says she has fully reckoned with her choices and accepts responsibility for her association with him, the public appetite for that reckoning is shaped by the specific details of what the documents showed, and a general expression of regret is unlikely to satisfy the specific questions they raised. The silence in this context is not the absence of a strategy, it is itself the strategy. By saying nothing, she preserves the space in which the something she eventually says can be as carefully constructed as possible. She is not going to win this particular moment in public opinion by responding in real time to documents that landed with the force they landed with. What she might be able to do in a controlled format at a time of her choosing, with the specific preparation that a significant interview arrangement allows for, is offer a version of events that provides enough of an explanation to make the situation manageable, not resolved. Not forgotten, manageables. And that is where the reported interview negotiation fits in. Reports from multiple credible outlets have indicated that conversations have been circulating in television boardrooms and streaming executive suites around a significant sum, as much as £1.3 million, with one American offer reportedly at around $1.75 million for a sit-down interview focused on her story, with the Epstein connection at its center. The framing that her allies are apparently pushing, according to these reports, is that she wants to tell her side of the story. And the most combustible element of that pitch, again according to the reports, is that she wants to present herself as a victim of Epstein rather than an enabler or a willing participant in his world. That framing is worth examining carefully because it is both the commercially necessary element of the pitch, a story in which she is a victim generates sympathy and viewership in ways that a story in which she simply made very bad choices does not, and the element most directly contradicted by the documents. The victim framing requires that she did not fully understand who Epstein was or what he was doing. It requires that the relationship was experienced from her end as one in which she was being misled or manipulated rather than one in which she was a genuinely engaged participant, and the documents make that argument very difficult to sustain. Not impossible, Epstein was a skilled manipulator of people, and the financial desperation that drove her toward him made her vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation he practiced. There is a version of her story in which those two things are both true simultaneously. But the specific language of her private communications to him and the specific timing of those communications relative to his known crimes makes the victim framing feel less like an honest account and more like a commercial requirement. What she might actually be able to offer that has genuine value not just to the entertainment industry that would pay for the interview, but to the public conversation about what happened and how it happened, is the financial story. The specific, concrete account of how the chronic financial desperation that defines her adult life created the conditions for the Epstein dependency. Not as an excuse but as an explanation. The spending habits that were never adequately matched by income. The repeated cycles of crisis and rescue and renewed crisis. The specific vulnerability that anyone in chronic, severe, documented financial difficulty has to anyone who presents themselves as a reliable source of relief. The way that financial dependency of that depth and that duration distorts judgment in ways that people who have never experienced that specific form of pressure find difficult to fully appreciate. That story is real. It is documented. It is supported by everything that has been reported about her financial history across 4 decades. And it is the story that most honestly explains, without excusing, how a woman of evident intelligence and evident warmth ended up sending warm emails to a convicted sex offender while publicly claiming to have severed contact with him. Not because she did not understand that what she was doing was wrong, but because the financial reality of her situation made the alternative, actually severing contact with someone who had become financially indispensable, feel impossible in ways that are easier to understand from the inside of that position than from the outside. The audience for that account exists and is real. Not an audience that will exonerate her, the documents exist, and the contradiction between the public statements and the private reality is too clear to be wished away by any amount of sympathetic narrative construction. But an audience that is willing to engage with the complexity of how someone ends up in a position like hers, that is interested in the human story underneath the scandal, that might come away from the interview with a more nuanced understanding of what happened, even if the overall assessment of her conduct does not fundamentally change. What she cannot offer, and what the interview would be catastrophically unwise to attempt, is a clean exoneration. Any account that positions her primarily as an innocent victim who was deceived and used and betrayed will immediately run into the specific language of the emails and the specific timeline of the communications, and every journalist and every analyst who covers the interview will spend the day after it was broadcast noting exactly where the account diverged from the documentary record. That day-after coverage would be more damaging than the original documents because it would add the charge of dishonesty to the charge of poor judgment. The congressional dimension is the factor that makes the entire calculation significantly more complicated than it would be if this was simply a media story. United States lawmakers have formally requested that Sarah Ferguson testify under oath before the House Oversight Committee. Congresswoman Sarah Subramaniam, a member of the committee investigating Epstein's network, stated publicly that Ferguson has information relevant to the investigation and should provide sworn testimony. A letter was sent with a deadline that has since passed without public response. Gloria Allred, representing several of Epstein's victims, stated that the files make it clear Ferguson is not the victim in this story. A television interview, however carefully constructed, is not a substitute for that testimony. And everything that might be said in the interview about her relationship with Epstein, her characterization of the relationship, her account of what she knew and when, her explanation of why the communications that are in the documentary record look the way they look, would be said without the protections of sworn testimony and without the specific legal weight that formal cooperation with investigators would carry. More importantly, it would be said in a format where the person asking the questions has agreed to a price for the conversation and therefore has a commercial interest in the conversation being watchable rather than in it being truly accountable. The difference between an interview conducted for a streaming platform and testimony given under oath is not simply procedural. It is the difference between a managed performance and an accountable statement of fact. There is also the geographic dimension that the reporting has consistently highlighted. Representatives have suggested that she does not feel able to film in the United States because the anger around the Epstein case there is so intense. The country where the biggest platforms and the biggest audiences and the biggest checks are available is also the country where the questions would be hardest, the legal exposure most acute, and the symbolic weight of her associations most toxic. If she cannot face the American audience in any direct sense, cannot film there, cannot apparently respond to congressional requests, apparently fears the scrutiny that the American legal and media environment would generate, then the interview being negotiated is by definition a more controlled version of the story than the full account would require. The City of York Council's unanimous decision to revoke her freedom of the city in March 2026 is worth considering as a measure of where the public temperature stands. Councillor Daryl Smalley's statement during the debate was direct and did not leave room for the kind of hedging that political communication usually prefers. They do not expect recipients of York's highest honor to be saints, he said. But they simply do not want them to be best friends of convicted pedophiles. That formulation, not asking for perfection, but drawing a clear line at a specific kind of association, represents the current public consensus position fairly accurately. The question the interview would need to answer for an audience operating from that starting point is not whether she made mistakes. It is whether the specific character of the relationship with Epstein and the specific gap between what she said publicly and what she was privately writing is adequately explained by any account she can honestly offer. Her daughters sit in the background of all of this as the dimension of the situation that complicates everything else. Beatrice and Eugenie have maintained contact with their mother while keeping a physical and public distance that their own circumstances require. Their names appeared in the 2009 email about visiting Epstein, which means any interview that addresses that email directly will involve discussion of a visit that their mother arranged to a convicted sex offender's home while they were present. Any honest account of that visit, what they knew about Epstein, whether they understood the nature of the relationship between their mother and the man they were visiting, how they felt about the visit at the time, and how they feel about it now, raises questions about people who have already been caught in enough of the crossfire from their parents' choices, without the crossfire being deliberately extended through an interview that places them back at its center. And Andrew, the one person whose situation is most directly affected by anything she might say. He is in Marsh Farm under criminal investigation. His legal posture has been adversarial, the threatened judicial review, the resistance to providing testimony through formal channels. Any account she gives that touches on their relationship, on what they shared and what they knew and what decisions they made together across the decades of their post-divorce domestic arrangement, is an account that touches on him directly. The question of whether an interview she gives serves or damages his legal position is not one that can be easily separated from the question of what an honest interview would require her to say. What does all of this suggest about what she is actually likely to do? The interview conversations continue, according to the reports. The price discussion apparently continues. The question of format and location and the specific nature of the agreement continues. And she continues to be silent in public while reportedly being more present in Britain and in Andrew's orbit than her extended disappearance might have implied. The most likely outcome, based on everything the available information suggests about how she operates and what her situation actually requires, is a carefully negotiated interview that gives enough of a story to generate the income she needs, that engages enough with the Epstein material to appear to address the central question, and that stops well short of the kind of fully honest account that would satisfy the congressional request or answer the most specific questions the documents raise. Not because she is incapable of honesty, but because the full truth told without management does not serve the specific purposes the interview is designed to serve. The silence that has lasted since September 2025 is ending in one form or another. Not because the situation has resolved itself. Not because the questions have been answered. But because the financial reality that drives so much of her decision-making, the collapsed businesses, the closed charity, the income streams that have disappeared, the lifestyle that continued to require funding even as the sources of that funding evaporated, is running out of patience with a strategy of deliberate absence. She is going to speak. The question is what she will say when she does. And the answer to that question, whatever form it eventually takes, will be measured against the document record that has been public since January 2026, and that does not change regardless of what any interview says about it. The snow in the Alps has been melting for months. The silence is ending. And the reckoning that the silence has been managing, for her, for the institution, for the daughter's court in the middle, and for the man in the farmhouse in Norfolk who is carrying his own version of exactly this same impossible situation, has not been resolved by the silence. It has only been delayed. What she says next will not close the chapter, but it will define what the rest of it looks like.